Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. It was the first time a Chinese leader has hosted any current or former Taiwan president in Beijing. But how significant was the meeting between Xi Jinping and Ma Ying-jeou of the opposition Kuomintang party on April 10th? We ask about the timing of the meeting just weeks before the inauguration of Taiwan's new president, whom Xi Jinping deeply dislikes, what messages Beijing intended to send, and whether Xi managed to counterbalance the summits in Washington between the leaders of the US, Japan and the Philippines. With us to discuss this are Mathieu Duchâtel, Institut Montaigne resident senior fellow and director of international studies, William Stanton, former American Institute in Taiwan director and National Chengchi University chair professor, and Wang Kai-chun, Office of ROC legislator, Hsu Chiao-hsin, foreign policy advisor. A very warm welcome to all of you on the show today. It was the second meeting between Ma Ying-jeou and Xi Jinping. 9 years earlier, they met in 2015 in Singapore when Ma was Taiwan president. This time, they met at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, greeting each other with a handshake that lasted 16 seconds. Ma addressed Xi as Mr. Xi and the General Secretary of the Communist Party, while Xi referred to Ma as Mr. Ma. Mathieu, if I can come to you first. So, what sort of messages do you think this meeting between these two men sent?
Well, I think first and foremost, there was a message, an intended message regarding Chinese cultural identity, the notion that the two sides of the Taiwan Strait share a cultural identity. And of course, it's a very classical message from the side of Beijing. But it's no longer a mainstream view in Taiwan that Chinese identity dominates Taiwan. On the contrary, Taiwan national identity has been on the rise and is currently mainstream. So the Beijing side is looking for allies within Taiwanese society that can convey this message to the domestic audience in China and also in Taiwan. And I think that's why the Japan context matters. Kishida was in the US at the same time. Ma Ying-jeou has been visiting the museum in Beijing that commemorates the war, the China-Japan war. Ma Ying-jeou has also been invited to a museum in Shanxi province where he was shown documents supposedly showing that the Diaoyu Islands are part of China. I think this common view on the history of China-Japan relations underscore this notion of shared cultural identity between the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. And the second element, I think, of the message is this idea that the two sides of the Taiwan Strait can manage peacefully their relationship. And here, of course, I think China's message is undermined by some of the military activities that are taking place at the same time. And I think that China is taking advantage of Ma Ying-jeou's self-perception as a peacemaker. And you mentioned the 2015 summit when Ma Ying-jeou was the president. I think at the time there was this idea in Taiwan that he wanted to win a Peace Nobel Prize. And I think somewhere in his mind, it's still there that he can play a historical role. Of course, the circumstances have changed.
Bill, peace on the one side, or purported peace, the peace journey of Ma Ying-jeou to China. Do you think that Xi and Ma were trying to set up a contrast with the meetings in Washington?
Oh, certainly. It was two Chinese brothers talking to one another in a certain sense. They wanted to convey, what they already believe, that the Chinese people are inseparable. Unfortunately, for an American, where people from all nationalities and ethnicities are living together, it's a strange concept that you have to have this cultural and really ethnic identity, and that you're one people. I think two telling details are, one is the Taiwanese people don't seem to care about this visit. I mean, the response has been very muted to it. It's not going to persuade anybody to change their views. We know that the largest percentage of the Taiwanese people don't believe in this kind of approach to the cross-strait relationship. And they also are constantly being surrounded by warplanes and naval ships that are threatening them, these gray zone tactics. So in a sense, people believe what they see. And on a regular basis, they see a China that is threatening rather than a China that's talking about brotherhood and, you know, we are all Chinese together. So I don't think it was I think it was a failed effort to try to convey a message that most people don't accept.
Right. So, Stephen, we heard there from both the other guests. Analysts did say that there was an attempt to contrast sort of the peace and the harmony and the family with what Beijing wants to portray as, the meetings in Washington, which were about defense, security.
Well, I do think, first of all, I think what Xi Jinping tries to convey is not only just targeting the audiences that are probably majority KMT supporters, but also I do think Xi Jinping also wants to speak indirectly to the next incoming president when it comes to under what kind of condition, in the sense that maybe the mainland will be willing to reinitiate any sorts of dialogues or interactions with the next government. So, some of the interesting thing is that even though former President Ying-jeou only talks about 92 consensus, only talks about one China separate interpretation, but we also perhaps need to pay attention to some of the underlying logic that pinned down President Ma's his entire presidency for 8 years. Is you also do have certain policy statements such as no independence, no unification, no use of force. You also have this idea of close to the United States, be friends with Japan, and also peace with the mainland. There's also another interesting idea is throughout President Ma's tenure, there's also some sort of unspoken consensus when it comes to there will be no recognition of sovereignty to each other, but also at the same time, there will be no denial of jurisdiction towards each other. So Xi Jinping, by meeting Ma Ying-jeou, himself right now as a private citizen, I think is trying to send some very interesting conditional signal to the incoming president.
So can you wrap up for us, summarize, what is the message to Lai?
So I think the message to Lai is if his incoming inauguration speech can touch upon some of the principles that Ma Ying-jeou represents, then maybe the comment by the mainland about, for example, tracing back to 2016, the Chinese view Tsai Ing-wen's speech as an incomplete exam paper. But if Lai Ching-te used the same kind of rhetoric, we're not sure what the Chinese will respond. So.
Okay, let's go to some of the opening speeches, which shows a lot of that language that our guests have been talking about. Let's take a look.
马先生素有民族情怀，坚持九二共识，反对台独，两岸同胞都是平等，外部的干涉阻挡不了家国团圆的历史大事。
两岸在1992年达成，各自以不同方式表述，海峡两岸均坚持一个中国原则的共识。未来两岸应该以确保人民福祉为最大目标，坚持九二共识，反对台独，求同存异。
Mathieu, do you think that there was much difference in the positions of Xi Jinping and Ma Ying-jeou there?
Well, I think the key word they both stressed is Chinese nations. Chonghua is the term that they've both been using. They also both stressed the language of the 92 consensus. But I think that Xi Jinping, in his talk, really underscored the problem from his perspective that outside forces or foreign forces are really the main obstacle to the development of cross-strait relations. And I don't think that the Ma Ying-jeou camp has really responded clearly to that element in Xi's positioning.
Though he said it in the opposite way, didn't he? He said that those external forces cannot separate us. That cannot stop the eventual reunion.
Which really means that from his perspective, what really blocks the development of cross-strait relations and his vision of unified Taiwan with the mainland is the intervention of external forces. But I think there's another force that really blocks the cross-strait unification, which Xi Jinping has conveniently ignored, and that's something that is really underlying in the whole conversation between Ma Ying-jeou and Xi Jinping, and that's the existence of the Republic of China and the de facto effective sovereignty of the Republic of China over Taiwan. We all saw the so-called slip of tongue of Ma Ying-jeou when he mentioned the Republic of China in front of Xi Jinping. There has been discussions whether this was intentional or not. Regardless of whether this was intentional or not, I think what we have on the side of Beijing is a classical united front strategy where you focus on the common ground that exists with the other side by ignoring the major difference, which is on this existence of the institutions of the Republic of China and the question of its sovereignty.
Which goes to the heart of the 1992 consensus itself, the so-called consensus.
No foreign force can separate us. Actually, what separates Taiwan and China is there's no support among the Taiwanese people. The polling always shows the vast majority, 80% or more, support the current status quo because they don't want to be part of China. So it's not foreign forces that keep Taiwan and China separate. It's that the Taiwanese people have good lives, they have democracy, they have freedom, and they don't want to be part of a communist dictatorship. You know, it doesn't appeal to them. So that's a problem that, Beijing needs to overcome.
Stephen, so why won't Beijing acknowledge that this is the case?
So I think in a sense, Beijing really has a very poor understanding when it comes to, first of all, the function of how our democracy works. And then secondly, when it comes to the Taiwanese people's response to a lot of the languages that CCP uses. But another thing that kind of stands out is the fact that when the two sides were speaking, they kind of both subtly acknowledges that both sides have different ways of life, that both sides came out from different social systems. And also at the same time, it kind of does suggested that subtly that perhaps from a KMT's point of view, right? So the emphasis on such as cultural similarities. So whenever, the interesting thing about when we talk about the Chinese nation, right? So I do believe the Chinese language, the kanji, the characters can have a lot of different meanings. So in a sense, I do believe that they're emphasizing about how both sides, when it comes to culture, when it comes to ethnicity, Taiwan still remains overwhelmingly Chinese ethnicity or Han Taiwanese ethnicity. So I do believe that's one thing that they can kind of stand upon. I mean, KMT and the CCP, in the sense that that is what paved the foundation for a so-called constructive ambiguity that the KMT has always has going to communicate with the CCP.
There is that shared Chinese identity, but what the CCP is wanting to change, wanting to change the status quo, is that essentially two self-governing nations become one.
Yes, and the time has proven again and again that even during President Ma's tenure, again, bringing back to one of his underlying logic is no independence and no unification. It takes time. So one of the things that I do believe KMT sometimes will advocate, and the people of Taiwan, through their actions of voting, will tell the Chinese that whatever languages they're using right now, whatever positions that you're taking right now, is not going to work for us. The Chinese languages, for example, about twisting or monopolizing the 92 consensus into the so-called one country, two system, KMT leaderships time and time again also emphasize there's no market for such a rhetoric.
Okay, so as we mentioned, a lot of the language of the two men centered on a shared Chinese identity and culture. So how much appeal does Chinese soft power hold for Taiwanese? According to a poll conducted by the Mainland Affairs Council in April, nearly 80% of the population does not agree with Beijing's stance that cross-strait dialogue can only resume under the One China 1992 consensus, and nearly 90% of respondents support maintaining the status quo, which is the current state of peace and stability. Back to you, Mathieu. What's your assessment of those results that we saw?
Well, I think that this is not really news, that there is a very strong majority in Taiwan for maintaining the status quo. That has been the case for a very long time. And I think it's no news either that there is no interest inside Taiwan for conducting cross-strait relations on the basis of the 92 consensus. Or if you look at it differently from the perspective of electoral strategy, it's very difficult. It's almost impossible, in fact, for a political party to win an election on the basis of a platform putting forward the 92 consensus. This is something that people are not really interested in. Probably they don't really understand. It's very complicated, this 92 consensus. There are so many different interpretations of a consensus that is itself about different interpretations that is not very appealing from democratic politics perspective. And I think the other thing is that this, going back to Taiwan's sovereignty, effective sovereignty, Taiwan, the Republic of China, if you look at it from the perspective of the KMT, it's very important, I think, for the Taiwanese population that there is some form of recognition by the other sides across the strait that this sovereignty exists. I think this has been an impediment to the development of cross-strait relations for a long time now, but it's still there. And I think that China keeps on ignoring this reality, and that's why we see the results that you've just shown.
Stephen, if I can come to you, actually. So if you could just describe what the 1992 consensus is.
So both sides does belong to a nation called China, but also there are different interpretations, different way to express what that nation of China looks like. So.
And in practical terms, maybe Bill, bring you in. So that means the different interpretations of China is whether it's the PRC or the ROC. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's basically not a consensus. You can't have a consensus where you say, well, we don't agree on a fundamental aspect of the consensus.
Mathieu, so given all this, how significant or how successful do you think Ma's trip could be?
Well, I think it creates space for policy making in Beijing, and that's very important. But this might be a short-term effect. And to me, this can be called the dream on strategy. Get China to continue dreaming about short-term, medium-term unification or a political agreement with Taiwan.
Yeah, because if I could just interject there, People's Daily apparently has been talking about how, this meeting demonstrated that there are people, there are, representatives in Taiwan that they still have good relationship with, and therefore leadership is still in control of,
Which is true. There are indeed people in Taiwan with whom the mainland has good relations. And I think that what we see as part of this meeting is an emphasis. It's not new, but it's re-emphasized on reaching out to the younger generation in Taiwan. And China perceived that there is a deep problem for its unification plans in the national identity of the younger generation. So they want to work on this more.
Yeah, and Ma actually took a delegation of youth with him, obviously.
Exactly, yes. And I think it also suggests that China intends to play the domestic political game in Taiwan in addition to coercion. Let's not forget that there is always a form of coercion in addition to what we are seeing, this diplomacy, this engagement with some parts of the blue camp in Taiwan. It suggests that China is eyeing the 2028 presidential election, hopes that by some political maneuvering, it can bolster the chance of the blue camp to win back the presidency. So that's what I think can be called the dream on strategy.
Bill, any other indicators that we could use to see whether this trip is successful? Maybe that's from the Chinese side. From the Taiwan side, it would surely be to ease current tensions.
Well, it's hard to see what Taiwan can do that would satisfy Beijing. And so, Taiwan is asked, above all, it's just made another statement just in the last couple of days, decrease the number of military missions, gray zone tactics around Taiwan. That would probably be the most concrete thing China could do to present a more benign view of itself to the Taiwanese people, but I don't see any signs that's going to be forthcoming. I think, they want a dual strategy, nice words, but keep up the military pressure.
Stephen, if you could tell us, does Ma represent the KMT or, a large proportion of the KMT? What's his standing in the party in Taiwan?
Well, I think first of all, right now, his identity when he travels to China and meet with Xi Jinping is a private citizen, right? He doesn't have any official positions. He also doesn't have any party position at this point. But he is definitely a individual citizen with great political significance. And when it comes to the idea of, for example, the people of Taiwan kind of overwhelmingly or somehow pushing back a lot of what the KMT has been emphasizing on. KMT occasionally is a little bit frustrated that the CCP twisted and also misinterpreted 92 consensus. And also, again, in democracy, right, election results are always the best way to find out what people desire, what people support in terms of their position. So KMT doesn't have to be frustrated. There's a reason why KMT is now the biggest caucus in the legislature yet, even though it's not unilateral majority. There's a reason why the DPP President-elect Lai only got 40% of the vote instead of over 50%. Mm-hmm. So that does kind of suggest whatever the DPP position is, whatever the KMT and also the TPP positions are, the people of Taiwan remain mixed. So in terms of the result and what is Ma's significance to this country, I do think it still requires some debate in the country because of the mixed opinions.
Okay, sure, but the legislator voting probably more reflected domestic issues.
Oh, sometimes they do. But also at the same time, we do need to understand that legislators, as legislators of the legislative yuan, a lot of times when we are drafting bills, we are focusing on the central government level. Mm-hmm. So yes, legislators do have to touch upon central affairs.
So foreign policy?
Precisely, national defense and foreign policy.
Okay. Mathieu, final question. So with the meeting was apparently originally supposed to take place on Monday. It was then moved back, postponed to Wednesday. We talked about, of course, what you think is the significance between, the Japan-US bilateral falling on the same day. It also fell on the same day as the 45th anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act. Would you like to assess any symbolism in that?
Well, there is indeed some symbolism. I think the goal on the Chinese side has always been to erode the US commitment to Taiwan's security. It's been extremely difficult for China to achieve results in that regard. But I think in the past 2 years, China has been active in nurturing some sort of skepticism towards the US commitment towards Taiwan security in Taiwan. This is clearly not mainstream, but this has appeared in the past 2 years. And I think China is actively using that sort of meaning to, in that objective, trying to convince the Taiwanese population that seeking support from the US is not how they will achieve lasting security. So there is a veiled threat, I think, in the messaging there.
Mm-hmm. Bill, I'd like to get your thoughts, of course.
Well, it's certainly not going to change American opinion. On Wednesday, the Department of State spokesperson was asked, do you have any comments on the Ma-Xi meeting? And the response was, no, I do not. So the U.S. is really downplaying the event, saying in a sense that it has no significance for U.S. policy, for the U.S. meetings with Japan, with the Philippines, and that U.S. policy is going to stay along the same lines, so it's not going to change.
Stephen, I'll quote to you another U.S. spokesperson's from the State Department's response to the same question. We support actions that de-escalate tensions and foster improved relations across the Taiwan Strait, advocating for ongoing dialogue grounded in dignity and respect. What do you make of that comment?
So, I do think it kind of reflected the Biden administration's consistent view in terms of encouraging cross-strait dialogues. But also at the same time, when it comes to the significance of it, I do believe it is a way for Xi Jinping to send out a signal that it is time to do a reset. 45 years ago, the military balance between the Republic of China, US, and the PRC are drastically different compared to now. And I do believe that, for example, there are a lot of significant political moments coming in this year and also next year. For example, you have the incoming US elections. You have, in the most proximity, is the President-elect's inauguration speech. So I do believe Beijing is trying to use this meeting as a way to say to the United States and Taiwan that if a reset is possible, is under these conditions. These are the things that I told former President Ma.
Right, but it's on, Mathieu, very, very final. It's on the PRC's terms, which is that Taiwan will become part of China.
Yeah, my final word would be that this visit is not a turning point, not a milestone. It's more an episode in cross-strait relations in the triangle, the US, China, Taiwan triangle.
It's not a possible reset, as Stephen said?
Possible reset, I have my doubts, but what is certain is that the most important episode of the year will be the US election. And I think that the US and China are managing tensions in the Taiwan Strait currently, but everything we can predict kind of stops in November. So everything that happens now happens within this short-term logic. And I think that's also what China is eyeing this US election in November.
Okay, so another possible or a real reset. We'll have to end it there. Thank you so much, Mathieu, Bill, and Stephen, for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for joining Taiwan Talks today. Take care and see you next time.